Sometimes the most unexpected visitors bring the answers we've spent a lifetime searching for. For Winry Dobbs, that visitor arrived on 4 tiny hooves during the coldest winter she could remember. The miniature donkey appeared at her cabin door, alone and hungry, miles from any ranch or farm. She fed him, named him Cricket, and figured she'd return him come spring. But Cricket had other plans. Every morning, he led her into the forest to places she'd never seen, yet somehow recognized. Places that stirred old memories about her brother, who vanished 30 years ago, and secrets buried with her family's past. What was this little creature trying to show her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Winry Dobbs had spent 40 years reading the language of the wild. She knew how elk moved through timber in deep snow, could identify a mountain lion's kill site from 100 yards out, and had tracked more black bears than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Her hands, weathered and capable at 67, had marked thousands of GPS coordinates, written countless field reports, and trained 2 generations of wildlife technicians in the art of patience and observation. Now those same hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of coffee as she stood on the porch of her hand-built cabin, watching the first light touch the peaks of the Colorado Rockies. The cabin sat at 9,200 feet, accessible only by a Forest Service road that became impassable from November through April. She'd built it herself over 3 summers, hauling materials on her back when the road washed out, fitting logs with the precision she'd learned from her father. Every joint was tight, every window positioned to catch the mountain's moods. The main room served as kitchen, library, and living space, with a wood stove she'd salvaged from an abandoned mine camp. Her bedroom was barely larger than the bed itself, but she needed little. A loft held her gear, her files, her records of 4 decades spent in service to creatures that never knew her name. She'd retired from the Colorado Division of Wildlife 8 months ago, turning in her truck and her radio on a sunny May afternoon. Her supervisor, a man 30 years her junior, had shaken her hand and said she was a legend. She'd smiled and told him legends were just people who'd stuck around long enough. The truth was simpler. She'd grown tired of committees and politics, of watching habitats shrink while meetings multiplied. She wanted to end her working life the way she'd begun it, alone in the mountains, accountable to nothing but her own conscience. The transition to full retirement had been harder than she'd expected. For 40 years, her purpose had been clear: track, observe, protect, document. Now her days stretched out with no schedule, no radio calls, no urgent missions. She journaled each morning, recording weather and animal sign out of habit. She split wood, maintained the solar panels, and kept her gear in field-ready condition, even though she had nowhere specific to go. Once a month, she made the drive down to Silverton for supplies and called her daughter from the library's payphone. Her cabin had no cell service, and she preferred it that way. Her daughter Lauren lived in Denver, worked in hospital administration, had a teenage daughter of her own. They spoke with the careful politeness of people who'd once been close but had drifted into separate orbits. Lauren had been 12 when Winry's brother Tommy disappeared, old enough to remember the chaos that followed, but young enough to need a mother who wasn't consumed by grief and guilt. Winry had failed at that. She'd thrown herself into her work, tracking animals instead of processing loss, and by the time she'd surfaced, Lauren had learned to manage without her. They'd never quite found their way back. The memories of Tommy were a constant ache she'd learned to carry. He'd been 5 years younger, gentle where she was fierce, drawn to poetry and music, while she'd preferred field guides and topographic maps. After his army service in the First Gulf War, he'd come home changed, quieter, jumpier, prone to long silences. Their parents hadn't understood PTSD, had treated it as weakness rather than wound. Winry had tried to help, but she'd been away often, following her career from one project to another. In October of 1995, Tommy had driven up to these mountains for what he'd called a simple hunting trip. They'd found his truck at a trailhead 3 days later. His rifle was in the cab, his pack was gone, and there was no trail to follow. Search and rescue had combed the area for 2 weeks. They'd found nothing. Her father had never accepted it. He'd spent his final years obsessed with the family's old mining claim, insisting Tommy had been searching for something connected to it. He'd covered maps with notations, filled journals with theories about hidden springs and shifting landmarks. The family had watched him unravel, attributing his obsession to grief-induced delusion. When he died of a heart attack 4 years after Tommy's disappearance, they'd boxed up his papers and tried to move forward. Winry's mother had lasted another 6 years before cancer took her. By then, the family had fractured completely, different versions of grief pulling them in different directions until there was nothing left to hold together. Winry had carried her guilt like a stone in her chest. She was the tracker, the expert, the one who could read signs that others missed. But she'd been in Montana on assignment when Tommy vanished, hadn't been part of the initial search. By the time she'd arrived, any trail had been obliterated by dozens of boots and paws. She'd looked anyway, spending every day off for 6 months hiking those mountains, finding nothing. Eventually, she'd had to accept that even her skills had limits. Now she lived in solitude by choice, or so she told herself. The cabin was her fortress against the weight of memory. She could control her environment here, could impose order on the small circle of her daily life. She woke at dawn regardless of season. She made coffee using the same careful ritual. She recorded weather data with the precision of long practice. She split wood, read books, and watched the mountains change with light and season. It was a small life, but it was predictable, and predictability felt like safety. The winter had come early and hard. By mid-October, snow had already buried the high country, and by November, her access road was drifted shut. She'd prepared thoroughly as always, 6 months of supplies, redundant heat sources, extensive medical kit, satellite emergency beacon. She'd done this for years, during fire season assignments and winter wildlife surveys. Isolation didn't frighten her. If anything, it felt like relief. But on the morning of December 3rd, something changed. She'd been at the woodpile behind the cabin, splitting rounds of beetle-kill pine, when she'd heard an unfamiliar sound. A bray, high-pitched and insistent. She'd set down her maul and walked around the cabin's north side. And there, standing in knee-deep snow at the edge of her clearing, was a miniature donkey. The creature was perhaps 3 feet tall at the shoulder, shaggy with winter coat and desperately thin. Its ribs showed through matted brown fur. It was covered in mud or possibly old manure, and its mane was tangled with burrs. But its eyes were bright and intelligent, and it showed no fear. It simply stood there, looking at her and brayed again. Winry had approached slowly, using the soft voice she employed with spooked wildlife. The donkey didn't retreat. Up close, she could see it was male, probably 5 or 6 years old, with hooves that needed trimming and a nasty scrape along one flank. Round its neck was a worn leather collar, with a small brass bell attached. The bell was tarnished but intact, and when the donkey shifted its weight, the bell gave a soft chime. She'd looked for tracks leading to her cabin, but found only the donkey's own hoofprints coming up the trail from the south. No vehicle tracks, no human footprints, nothing to indicate how this creature had ended up alone at 9,200 feet in December. The nearest ranch was 8 miles down valley, and there were no farms or homesteads between. No one ran livestock up here in winter? It made no sense. The donkey had allowed her to touch him, to examine him for injuries. The scrape on his flank was superficial, already scabbing over. He was dehydrated and starving, but otherwise sound. She'd led him to her small equipment shed, cleared a space, and bedded him down with pine boughs. She'd mixed warm water with oats and molasses, meant for her own consumption, but more urgently needed here, and watched him eat with methodical focus. Then she'd hauled water, filled a bucket, and watched him drink nearly 2 gallons. That first night she'd checked on him every few hours, expecting him to be gone or dead by morning. He was neither. He was resting comfortably, and when she'd entered the shed at dawn, he'd greeted her with a soft nicker that sounded almost like welcome. She'd named him Cricket on the 2nd day, after the way his hooves clicked on the shed's plywood floor. She'd cleaned him up as best she could. treating the scrape with antibiotic ointment, working the burrs from his mane, and trimming his hooves with a farrier's knife she'd used on pack mules during backcountry surveys. He'd stood patiently through all of it, as though he understood she was helping. The brass bell had caught her attention during the grooming. It was handmade, not factory-produced, with careful engraving partially obscured by tarnish. She'd cleaned it gently with vinegar and discovered initials etched into the brass, TD. She'd stared at those letters for a long time, her pulse loud in her ears. Tommy Dobbs, but that was impossible. Thousands of people had those initials. It meant nothing, except it felt like something. Cricket had recovered quickly with regular feed and water. Within a week, he was alert, active, and had even put on visible weight. Winry had accepted that she'd be keeping him until spring thaw allowed her to investigate his origins properly. She'd fashioned a better shelter inside the shed, laid in extra feed from her own supplies, and established a routine. Every morning, she'd let him out to walk around the clearing, and every evening she'd bring him back in before dark. But on the morning of December 10th, Cricket had refused to return to the shed. Instead, he'd walked to the trailhead and stopped, looking back at her expectantly. She'd tried to lead him back. He'd refused, planting his hooves and braying softly. Then he'd taken a few steps down the trail and looked back again. The message was unmistakable. "Follow me." Winry had stood there in the cold, debating. She'd seen plenty of animals display intelligent behavior, but this felt different. This felt purposeful. Against her better judgment, she'd gone inside, dressed for a winter hike, and followed the small donkey into the forest. Cricket had led her on a winding path through timber and across frozen meadows. He'd moved with confidence, never hesitating at intersections, never deviating from whatever route he'd chosen. After 2 hours, he'd stopped at a frozen creek in a small clearing. Winry had checked her GPS and recorded the coordinates, but the location meant nothing to her. It wasn't on any trail she'd mapped, wasn't near any significant landmark, yet standing there she'd felt a strange sensation, not quite déjà vu, but a whisper of familiarity, as though she'd been here before, but couldn't quite remember when. Cricket had stood at the creek's edge for several minutes, then turned and led her back to the cabin. The entire expedition had taken 4 hours. That night, exhausted and confused, Winry had pulled out her old field notes and maps, trying to determine if she'd ever documented that clearing. She'd found nothing. The next morning, Cricket had insisted they go out again. Over the next 3 days, Cricket established a pattern. Each dawn, he would wait at the trailhead until Winry geared up and followed. Each time, he led her to a different location, a rocky outcrop, a stand of aspen, a boulder field. Each time, she felt that same unsettling twinge of recognition. And each time, she found nothing that explained why he'd brought her there. On the morning of December 14th, everything changed. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the sky held that peculiar quality that promised more snow. Winry had considered keeping Cricket in the shed, but he'd been insistent, pawing at the door and braying until she'd relented. She dressed in her warmest layers, packed extra supplies, and followed him into the pre-dawn darkness. This time, Cricket had led her on a longer route, climbing higher into terrain that skirted the tree line. The wind cut through her layers, and her breath came hard in the thin air. She was in excellent condition for her age, but this was a serious push. Cricket somehow seemed tireless. After 2 hours of steady climbing, he'd led her into a clearing she was certain she'd never seen. It was perhaps 40 yards across, ringed by Engelmann spruce, with a massive boulder at its center. Snow had drifted deep here, undisturbed except by their passage. Cricket had walked directly to the boulder and stopped. Winry had approached slowly, scanning the area out of habit. That's when she seen it. A small object partially exposed in the snow near the boulder's base. She'd knelt, brushed away the powder, and felt her heart stop. It was a pocket knife, not just any pocket knife. A case XX with a worn bone handle, the brass shield still visible. She'd picked it up with shaking hands, wiping away moisture, and found the initials she'd engraved herself 31 years ago, TD. This was Tommy's knife. The knife she'd given him for his 16th birthday. The knife he'd carried every single day after that, worn smooth from constant handling. The knife that should have been with him when he disappeared, or found with his remains if he'd died in these mountains, but here it was, in her hands, in a clearing she'd never mapped, looking as though it had been lost yesterday, rather than 3 decades ago. The blade was still sharp, the brass free of corrosion, the handle intact. It should have been destroyed by 30 seasons of freeze and thaw, rusted beyond recognition, falling apart. Instead, it looked barely aged. Winry had sat back in the snow, the knife clutched in her fist as her mind raced through impossible scenarios. Someone had planted it. Someone had found it years ago and dropped it here recently. It wasn't really Tommy's knife, just an identical model with the same initials. But each explanation crumbled under scrutiny. Who would plant it here? Why? And she knew this knife, knew every scratch on the handle, every spot where the brass had worn thin. This was Tommy's. Cricket had stood beside her, watching with those intelligent dark eyes, and for the first time she'd spoken to him as though he could understand. "What are you showing me?" The memories had come flooding back then, sharp and painful. The day Tommy had opened her gift, his face lighting up with genuine joy. The way he'd carried that knife everywhere, using it to whittle, to cut rope, to clean fish. The morning she'd identified his truck at the trailhead, and known, with sick certainty, that something terrible had happened. The search, the empty weeks, the slow death of hope, and now this. She'd forced herself to stand, to think like the tracker she'd been trained to be. She'd photographed the knife, the exact location where she'd found it, the surrounding terrain. She'd taken GPS coordinates and made detailed notes. Then she'd examined the clearing more carefully. The boulder was granite, weathered and ancient, surrounded by undisturbed snow. No other tracks, no other signs of recent human presence. But as she'd circled it, something had nagged at her. The clearing itself felt significant, not just familiar, but important. As though she'd been here not as an adult, but as a child. She'd closed her eyes and reached for the memory. Slowly it had surfaced, her father's voice, younger and stronger, saying something about the old claim marker. Her own child self, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing in this clearing with Tommy beside her. Her father had been showing them something, explaining something about the family land. She'd been bored, impatient to get back to hiking. But Tommy had been fascinated, asking questions. The memory was fragmentary, unreliable. But it was there. She'd pulled out her phone, no service, but she'd loaded topographic maps onto it before winter isolation. She'd checked their location against old property records she'd digitized from her father's papers. Her pulse had quickened. This clearing sat just inside the boundary of what had once been her great-grandfather's mining claim. Filed in 1887 and abandoned by 1910, her father had maintained that the claim had never been properly surveyed, that the actual boundaries were different from the official records. He'd been trying to prove it when he died. Cricket had poured the snow beside the boulder, exposing more ground. Winry had knelt again and begun to dig carefully with her gloved hands. 6 inches down, she'd found something else. A piece of rusted metal, square and flat. She'd worked it free and cleaned it off. It was a surveyor's marker, the kind used in the late 1800s, stamped with initials she recognized. J.D. James Dobbs, her great-grandfather. The pieces were connecting in ways that made no rational sense, but felt undeniably true. Tommy hadn't simply gone hunting that October day. He'd been looking for something. The family claim, the land their father had obsessed over. And he'd found this clearing, this marker. Maybe he'd found the knife here too. Perhaps it had fallen from his pack on an earlier trip. But why had he come back? What had he been searching for? She'd looked at Cricket, who stood watching her with that same patient intelligence. "You knew this was here," she'd said quietly. Somehow you knew. The sun had climbed higher, and she'd known they needed to head back. The knife was safely in her pack, wrapped in a spare glove. The marker stayed where it was, too heavy to carry and less personally significant. She'd taken photographs of everything, her mind already racing ahead to what this meant. The hike back had been quiet except for the crunch of snow and her own ragged breathing. Cricket had led her down a slightly different route, perhaps easier, perhaps just his preference. She'd followed in a daze, the knife a burning weight against her back. That evening, sitting beside the wood stove with Cricket resting in his shed, Winry had spread out her father's old papers. She'd been through them before, after his death, but she hadn't been looking for anything specific. Now she had a focus. Her father's obsession had centered on something he called Lost Spring, a water source mentioned in her great-grandfather's original claim filing. According to the documents, Lost Spring had been the reason James Dobbs had filed the claim at all. The water was supposedly pure and constant, emerging from an unusual rock formation. He'd planned to bottle and sell it, a common scheme in the mining boom days. But the operation had never materialized. James had abandoned the claim and moved to town, eventually opening a hardware store instead. Her father had believed Lost Spring still existed, but had never been properly mapped. He'd thought the old surveys were inaccurate, that the spring lay on land the family technically still had rights to. More importantly, he'd believed Tommy had gone looking for it the day he disappeared. Winry had always dismissed this as grief-talking, a man unable to accept random tragedy, constructing elaborate meaning where there was none. But now, holding Tommy's impossible knife, standing in a clearing that sat precisely on the disputed claim boundary, she wasn't so sure. She'd found her father's hand-drawn maps, marked with locations he'd wanted to search. She'd compared them to her own GPS coordinates from the past 2 weeks. Her breath had caught. Every single place Cricket had led her corresponded to a mark on her father's map. Every single one. She'd stood up so fast her chair had tipped over. Cricket had responded with a soft bray from the shed. She'd gone outside, crossing the clearing in the starlight, and opened the shed door. The little donkey had looked up at her calmly. "What are you?" she'd asked, her voice shaking. Cricket had simply gazed at her with those dark, knowing eyes. That night, Winry hadn't slept. She'd sat at her table, the knife before her, and tried to construct a rational explanation. Someone was playing an elaborate hoax. The knife wasn't really Tommy's. She was losing her grip on reality, isolated too long, seeing patterns that didn't exist. But each explanation fell apart under examination. The knife was real. The locations were real. The impossible preservation, the uncanny guidance, the mysterious donkey, all real. By dawn, she'd made a decision. She would follow Cricket wherever he led. She would document everything with scientific rigor. She would pursue this mystery to whatever end it reached, because for the first time in 30 years, she had something that felt like a trail. And Winry Dobbs knew how to follow a trail. She'd retrieved the brass bell from Cricket's collar, cleaning it more thoroughly in the early light. The initials were clearer now, TD, followed by numbers, 1995. The year Tommy disappeared, impossible, but undeniable. Cricket had been waiting at the trailhead when she'd stepped outside. She'd looked at him, this small, patient creature who'd walked out of nowhere into her isolated winter, and felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite belief, but something close. "All right," she'd said quietly. "Show me." And together they'd walked back into the forest. Winry approached the following week with methodical precision. If she was going to pursue this, and she would do it properly. Every morning, she prepared as though for a field survey. GPS unit charged, camera ready, field notebook waterproofed, emergency supplies packed. She documented every location Cricket led her to with coordinates, photographs, and detailed written observations. She cross-referenced each site with her father's maps and her own knowledge of the terrain. Cricket took her to 4 more locations over the next 7 days. At the second site, she found her father's old compass. It was a surveyor's brass compass, distinctive, because her father had dented the case while rappelling down a cliff face in his youth. She'd seen that compass 1,000 times, watched him use it on camping trips and property walks. After his death, it had disappeared. They'd assumed someone had cleaned out his effects and donated or discarded it. But here it was, lying on flat rock beneath 6 inches of snow, as though waiting. The compass was functional but strange. When she'd opened the case, the needle had spun erratically, refusing to settle on north. She checked her own compass. It worked fine, but her father's compass seemed to respond to something other than magnetic north, the needle pulling consistently toward the northwest, deeper into the mountains. At the third site, she'd found nothing physical, but the location itself had been profoundly familiar, a small saddle between two peaks where water would flow during spring melt. She'd stood there for 20 minutes, letting the memory surface, and finally recalled her father had brought the whole family here when she was maybe 10. He'd been excited, insistent, talking about how this was the watershed for the lost spring. Her mother had been annoyed at the long hike for what seemed like nothing. Tommy had been 7, stumbling in his oversized boots, holding tight to their father's hand. The fourth site had yielded something that had shaken her. A fragment of military-issue canteen. She'd recognized it immediately. The distinctive stamped letters U.S. Army on the olive drab plastic. Tommy's canteen from his service years. He'd kept using it long after his discharge, preferring it to civilian models. She'd found it caught in the branches of a downed tree, still attached to a rotting piece of web belt. Inside the canteen was a Ziploc bag, somehow intact, containing dried plant material. Winry had been careful not to contaminate the contents. She'd photographed everything in situ before carefully extracting the bag. The plant material looked like sage, but was a variety she didn't immediately recognize. The herbs were brittle but well preserved, releasing a sharp, clean scent when she'd opened the bag in her cabin that night. She'd considered her options and made a difficult decision. She needed expert help, but she couldn't reveal the full situation without sounding delusional. The next morning, after Cricket's daily trek, she'd hiked down to where she'd hidden her truck before the snow had closed the road completely. It took her 3 hours of snowshoeing, but she'd needed her satellite phone, which she kept in the truck for emergencies. From a windswept ridge with clear sky view, she'd called Dr. Vincent Hayes, a retired anthropology professor from Fort Lewis College, whom she'd worked with on several wildlife surveys near indigenous cultural sites. Vince was in his 70s, sharp as ever, and more importantly, not prone to jumping to conclusions. Winry Dobbs, he'd answered warmly. Thought you'd hibernated for the winter. More or less, she'd said. Vince, I need your expertise. Off the record, she'd described the plant material carefully, avoiding any mention of how she'd obtained it. She'd texted him photos. His response had come after a long pause. That's white sage, Salvia apiana, but the preparation is specific. The way it's bundled and dried, that's ceremonial, used in indigenous cleansing rituals, vision quests, spiritual preparation. Where did you find this? Old cache site. Might be connected to historical use of the area. Historical like how old? Maybe 30 years. Another pause. Winry sage prepared this way doesn't just show up randomly. Someone was engaged in deliberate spiritual practice. This is the kind of preparation you'd see before a vision quest or a journey into sacred space. She'd felt her scalp prickle. Sacred space? The Ute people, whose traditional territory includes your area, recognize certain locations as thin places, spots where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is permeable. Springs, caves, certain peaks. They'd prepare with fasting, prayer, and herbs like this sage before entering those spaces. Why? Seeking guidance, healing, transformation. Vision quests were serious undertakings. Still are, for traditional practitioners. Winry had looked out over the mountains, the phone cold against her ear. If someone was preparing for that kind of experience, what would you expect to find? Physically, I mean. Depends on the location and the tradition. Often there'd be offerings, stones, tobacco, cornmeal, sometimes markers indicating the boundary of sacred space. And there'd usually be a specific destination. A spring, a cave, somewhere significant. She'd thanked him, promised to stay in touch, and ended the call. The hike back to the cabin had given her time to think. Tommy had been struggling after the war. Their father had been obsessed with finding lost spring. What if Tommy had learned something about the spring's significance beyond family legend? What if he'd sought it out not for water rights or nostalgia, but for healing? It was a theory, nothing more. But it fit. That evening, She'd examined the brass bell again, studying it under her desk lamp with a magnifying glass. The engraving was definitely TD 1995, but there was something else, smaller marks on the bell's interior surface that she'd missed before. She'd angled the light carefully and made out what looked like coordinates, hand-etched in tiny numbers. Her pulse had quickened. She'd copied the numbers and plotted them on her map. They indicated a location about 6 miles northwest of her cabin, in a remote basin she'd surveyed once, years ago. She'd found nothing remarkable there, just typical high-country terrain. But she'd been looking for wildlife habitat, not spiritual significance. Cricket had shifted in his shed, the sound carrying through the thin wall. She'd realized something that made her stand up and walk outside. The donkey had appeared during the coldest part of winter, in terrain that should have been impassable for a creature his size. He'd arrived at her door specifically, despite dozens of other cabins and buildings closer to civilization. He wore a bell with Tommy's initials and the year of his disappearance, and he'd been leading her methodically to places marked on her father's maps. This was not coincidence. This was not explainable by normal means. She'd opened the shed door. Cricket had looked at her calmly, moonlight reflecting in his eyes. "You're not just a donkey, are you?" she'd said softly. Cricket had taken 2 steps forward and gently pressed his forehead against her chest. She'd felt warmth radiating from him, felt something she couldn't name, comfort maybe, or reassurance. Her hand had come up automatically to stroke his neck, and she'd felt tears on her cheeks for the first time in years. "I don't understand this," she'd whispered. "I don't understand any of this, but I'm trying." Cricket had stayed pressed against her for a long moment, then stepped back and returned to his bed of pine boughs. She'd watched him settle, then closed the door and returned to the cabin. She'd sat at her table with the knife, the compass, the canteen, the photographs of the surveyor's marker, and her father's maps spread before her. 9 locations now, each one corresponding to her father's marks. Each one triggering memories or yielding artifacts impossible to ignore. The pattern was clear, even if its meaning wasn't. She'd opened her laptop. No internet, but she'd loaded extensive files before winter isolation and searched her own archive. She'd found what she was looking for. Her notes from that long-ago survey of the basin, indicated by the coordinates on Cricket's bell. She'd described the terrain, the vegetation, the wildlife sign. And in passing, she'd noted an unusual acoustic quality to the basin, a sense of sound behaving strangely, echoing in ways that didn't match the topography. At the time, she'd attributed it to wind patterns or her own fatigue. Now she wondered what she'd missed. She'd made a decision. Tomorrow, weather permitting, she'd ask Cricket to take her to that basin. The coordinates on the bell felt like a destination, not just another waypoint. If Tommy had been on a quest, if he'd been seeking something specific, maybe this was where the trail led. But first, she needed to confront her own fear, because the evidence was pointing toward something she couldn't accept without abandoning everything she thought she understood about the world. And Winry Dobbs had built her entire life on rational observation and provable fact. She'd lain in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the pines. Her brother had vanished 3 decades ago. Her father had died searching for answers. And now a mysterious donkey was leading her along the same trail, toward the same mystery. Either she was losing her mind, or reality was far stranger than she'd ever imagined. By morning, she'd made her choice. She would follow this to the end, wherever it led. She owed that much to Tommy, to her father. To herself, the weather turned before dawn. Winry woke to the sharp scent of incoming snow and the particular silence that preceded a major storm. She checked her barometer and weather radio. A low-pressure system was pushing in fast, bringing what forecasters called significant accumulation. She had maybe 6 hours before travel became dangerous. Cricket was already waiting at the trailhead when she finished her preparations. She'd packed for emergency overnight stay, just in case they got caught out. The coordinates from the bell were programmed into her GPS. She'd left a note on her table with her planned route and destination, old habit from decades of field work. If something happened, at least there'd be a record. They'd set out at first light, and Cricket had moved with unusual urgency. Instead of his typical measured pace, he'd pushed ahead, stopping only briefly to ensure she was following. The message was clear. We need to reach the destination before the storm hits. The route took them up and over a ridge, then down into a drainage system she knew only from maps. The terrain was rough, deadfall and scree fields alternating with dense timber. Several times, Winry had to scramble on all fours, her pack catching on branches. Cricket navigated it all with surprising agility, his small size an advantage in the tight spaces. 3 hours in, they'd reached the basin. It was shaped like a shallow bowl, perhaps 200 yards across, ringed by cliffs on 3 sides. The forest here was old growth, massive spruces that had been saplings when her great-grandfather filed his claim. Snow lay deep and undisturbed, creating an almost dreamlike quality. As though they'd stepped outside of time, Cricket had led her to the eastern edge of the basin, where a tumble of boulders created a natural rampart against the cliff face. He'd stopped, turned to look at her and brayed once, a sound that echoed strangely in the enclosed space, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Winry had felt it immediately, the wrongness Vince had called a thin place. The air felt different here, charged somehow, making her skin prickle. Sound behaved oddly, just as she'd noted years ago. And there was a scent, faint but distinct, mineral and clean, like water over stone. She'd moved toward the boulders, and Cricket had followed. That's when she'd seen it, a gap between 2 massive rocks, partially obscured by an overhang. The gap was narrow, maybe 2 feet wide, but it led somewhere. She'd turned on her headlamp and peered inside. A passage. Not natural cave formation, but deliberately constructed, stones stacked and fitted with the skill of someone who understood both engineering and the mountain's moods. She'd run her gloved hand over the stonework and felt the craftsmanship. This was old, built with the same techniques her great-grandfather's generation had used. Cricket had pushed past her into the passage, and she'd had no choice but to follow. The passage was short, maybe 15 feet, and opened into a small natural chamber. The ceiling was perhaps 8 feet high, the floor relatively flat. And there, in the center of the chamber, was a cairn, a deliberately stacked pile of stones, with a flat stone on top serving as a kind of altar or platform. On the platform was a box. Winry's hands had shaken as she'd approached it. The box was made of metal, weatherproof, and sealed with wax. She'd photographed it in place, documented its position, then carefully lifted it. It was surprisingly light. The wax seal bore an imprint, the letters J.D., her great-grandfather's initials. She'd carried the box outside where the light was better, Cricket following. The storm was building, the first flakes already falling, the wind picking up. She'd known she should seek shelter, but her hands had moved of their own accord, breaking the wax seal. Opening the lid, inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. She'd unwrapped it carefully. The leather was in remarkable condition, supple and intact. She'd opened to the first page and seen her father's handwriting, strong and clear, dated just 2 months before his death. Her vision had blurred with tears. She'd forced herself to focus, to read. The entries had begun methodically, her father documenting his research into the family claim, his attempts to locate lost spring, his growing conviction that the spring was real and significant. But as the entries progressed, they'd become more intense, more urgent. He'd written about dreams of Tommy, dreams where his son had been trying to tell him something. He'd described finding some of the same artifacts she'd discovered, the surveyor's marker, traces of old paths. He documented his theory that lost spring existed in what he called shifting space, a location that wasn't fixed on any map, because it didn't exist in the same way normal geography existed. The term had made Winry's skin crawl. But her father had written with scientific precision, citing indigenous accounts of sacred springs that moved or could only be found under certain conditions. He'd referenced geological papers about magnetic anomalies in the area, about unusual water chemistry in certain springs, and then she'd reached the entry that had made her sit down hard on the frozen ground. "I've seen it," her father had written. "Last night, in the clearest dream I've ever experienced, Tommy showed me where to look. He was standing beside a spring of such clarity it looked like liquid light. He looked at peace, whole in a way he never was after the war. He told me the spring exists between moments, in a fold of time and space that the old ones knew how to access. He said he found it by accident or maybe by need, and that it gave him what he couldn't find in our world, silence from the war in his head. He's been there ever since, healing. He says it only feels like months to him, but he knows decades have passed out here. He's ready to come home, but he needs help. He needs someone to open the way from this side." The journal had continued, "I know how this sounds. I know what people will think, but I've spent months verifying everything I can. The spring is real. The old claim documents mention it as a place of unusual properties. The Ute stories describe it as a healing place between worlds. And my dreams of Tommy aren't just dreams. They're too specific, too consistent. He's trying to communicate. I'm going to find a way to reach him. I'm going to bring my son home." The entries had ended there, mid-project. Because her father had died 3 weeks later, Winry had sat in the falling snow, the journal open in her lap, and felt the world tilt. Her father hadn't been delusional. He'd been close, so close to something real. And he'd died before he could complete what he'd started. She'd looked at Cricket, who stood watching her with those impossibly knowing eyes. "You came to finish what he started," she'd said aloud. "Didn't you?" Cricket had brayed softly, and the sound had carried that same strange echo, as though the basin itself was responding. She'd returned to the chamber, searching more carefully now. In the dim beam of her headlamp, she'd found them, carved symbols on the rock walls, similar to those she'd seen at the frozen waterfall, but more extensive. Spirals and lines, geometric patterns that seemed to map something beyond physical geography. And there, at the back of the chamber, she'd found a smaller alcove containing offerings, stones, feathers, fragments of turquoise. She'd reached into the alcove and extracted one of the turquoise pieces. It had been warm in her hand, radiating heat despite the cold. She'd turned it over and found markings on its underside, more symbols carved with precision. The turquoise had gone into her pack alongside the journal. She'd photographed everything else, documenting the chamber thoroughly, despite the storm's pressure. When she'd emerged, the snow was falling heavily, visibility down to 50 feet. Cricket had immediately started back the way they'd come, and Winry had followed. Understanding they were in a race against the weather, they'd made it back to the cabin as darkness fell, both of them coated in white, exhausted and cold. She'd settled Cricket in his shed with extra feed, then collapsed inside her cabin, peeling off frozen layers with shaking hands. That night, she'd read her father's entire journal by lamplight. Every entry, every sketch, every theory, and slowly, impossibly, a picture had emerged. Lost Spring was real. It existed in some kind of liminal space, not fully in one reality or another. Tommy had found it, deliberately or by chance, and had stayed there, healing from trauma that this world couldn't fix. Time moved differently there. He'd experienced months while decades passed here, and now somehow he was ready to return. But he needed help from this side. Cricket was that help. A guide, a messenger, maybe something more. Her father's journal had mentioned animal guides in indigenous traditions. Spirits that took physical form to help those who were lost or searching. She'd looked out the window at the shed where Cricket rested. Was he spirit or flesh? Both? Neither? Did it matter? The journal's final pages had contained instructions, incomplete but suggestive. Her father had theorized that the locations he'd marked formed a kind of key or pathway, that visiting them in sequence, with proper intention and offerings, would create a resonance that could open the door to Lost Spring. He'd been planning to try it. He died before he could. Winry had sat back, the implications washing over her. Cricket had been leading her through those locations systematically. 9 so far. Her father's map had shown 10. One more location to visit, and then what? She'd pulled out the turquoise, studying it in the lamplight. The symbols seemed to shift and move, though she knew that was tricks of light and exhaustion. Or was it? Nothing was certain anymore. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, Winry made her decision. She would finish what her father had started. She would complete the sequence. She would find out if Lost Spring was real. And if her brother really had been waiting there for 30 years, she would open the door. If a door existed to be opened. The storm lasted 3 days, dumping nearly 4 feet of new snow. Winry used the time to prepare, studying her father's journal obsessively, cross-referencing it with everything she'd found. She organized the artifacts on her table like pieces of a puzzle. The knife, the compass, the canteen, the turquoise, the photographs of the surveyor's marker, each one a breadcrumb along a trail her father and brother had walked before her. She also made a difficult decision. She called Lauren. The conversation, conducted on her satellite phone from the ridge above her cabin once the storm cleared, was among the hardest she'd ever initiated. "Mom?" Lauren had answered, surprised. "It's not our regular day." "Are you okay?" "I need to tell you something," Winry had begun. "And I need you to listen all the way through before deciding I've lost my mind." She told Lauren everything. The donkey's arrival, the locations, the artifacts, the journal. She'd been clinical in her presentation, sticking to facts. But she hadn't hidden her conclusion. Something impossible was happening, and she was going to pursue it to whatever end. Lauren's silence had stretched long. Then, "Mom, I'm worried about you. Winter isolation can affect people's judgment. What you're describing, I know how it sounds, do you? Because it sounds like you've constructed an elaborate fantasy to avoid accepting that Uncle Tommy died 30 years ago." The words had stung, because Winry had considered the same thing. "I've documented everything," she'd said quietly. "Photographs, GPS coordinates, physical artifacts. If I'm delusional, I'm doing it with remarkable consistency, or you're finding what you want to find. Confirmation bias. You know about that. I do. I've spent the last week trying to debunk my own observations. I can't. Something real is happening here." Another long pause. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to know what I'm doing. If something happens to me, I want there to be a record." And Winry had stopped, surprised by her own emotion. "And I want you to understand that this isn't about running away from reality. This is about finally, after 30 years, having something that feels like a trail. I'm a tracker, Lauren. It's what I am. I can't ignore a trail." Lauren had sighed, a sound that carried all the accumulated weight of their complicated relationship. "I can't stop you." "No, but I can come up there. Give me 2 days. If the roads are passable, I'm driving up." "Lauren, you don't need to." "Mom, you're talking about chasing after a mystical spring led by a psychic donkey to find your dead brother." "Yes, I need to come up there." Despite everything, Winry had smiled. "When you put it that way, promise me you won't do anything until I get there. Promise me." Winry had looked out over the mountains, bright and clean in the post-storm sunshine. Cricket was a small, dark shape moving through the snow near her cabin. "I promise." They'd ended the call, and Winry had returned to the cabin feeling strangely lighter. She'd told someone. The secret was shared, however skeptically received. She wasn't completely alone in this anymore. Cricket had met her at the door, and she'd knelt in the snow to look at him eye level. "We wait for Lauren," she'd told him. 2 more days. Can you be patient?" The donkey had touched his nose to her forehead, and she'd felt that same inexplicable warmth she'd noticed before. The next 2 days had been a strange interlude. Winry had prepared practically, checking her gear, organizing supplies, writing detailed notes about everything she'd discovered. But she'd also prepared in ways she'd never have considered before. She'd researched indigenous offering protocols, reading everything in her downloaded files about proper respect for sacred spaces. She'd set aside tobacco, cornmeal, and a small braid of sweetgrass she'd bought years ago from a Ute craftsperson at a powwow. She'd also called Dr. Hayes again, this time more forthcoming about what she'd found. "Vince," she'd said, "hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to approach a thin place with proper respect, what would they need to know?" "Hypothetically?" His voice had carried amusement and concern. "Winry, what have you gotten yourself into?" "I'm not sure yet. That's what I'm trying to find out." He'd been quiet for a moment. "The most important thing is intention. These aren't tourist sites. If they're real, and I'm not saying they are, but if they are, they respond to the heart of the person approaching. You can't lie to them. You can't manipulate them. You come with genuine need, genuine respect, or you don't come at all. What happens if you approach incorrectly? Traditional accounts vary. At best, nothing. The place simply doesn't reveal itself. At worst, well, there are stories of people getting lost, experiencing time distortions, coming back changed. Changed how? That's where the accounts get unreliable. But the consistent thread is that these places are powerful. They're not dangerous in the sense of malicious, but they're not safe in the sense of controlled. Does that make sense? It does. Winry, I've known you 20 years. You're one of the most rational people I've ever met. If you're taking this seriously, there must be a reason. Just be careful. And remember that some doors, once opened, can't be closed the same way. She'd thanked him and ended the call with those words echoing. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. Lauren had arrived on the afternoon of the second day, her Subaru somehow navigating the terrible road with a combination of skill and determination. She'd emerged from the car, bundled in expensive winter gear, her face tight with worry and skepticism. Winry had greeted her on the porch. For a moment, they'd simply looked at each other. Then Lauren had said, "Show me." Winry had shown her everything. The artifacts, the journal, the maps, the photographs. She'd walked Lauren through each discovery, each impossible preservation, each piece of evidence. And then she'd taken her to meet Cricket. The donkey had been resting in his shed, and he'd looked up calmly as the two women entered. Lauren had stopped in the doorway staring. "That's really a miniature donkey," she'd said. "Yes, at 9,200 feet. In winter, looking healthy and well-fed." Yes, Lauren had approached slowly. Cricket had watched her with those dark, intelligent eyes. When Lauren had reached out tentatively, Cricket had stepped forward and placed his head directly in her palm. The brass bell had rung softly. Lauren had gone very still. Then she'd looked at the bell, seen the engraving, and her breath had caught. TD 1995. Yes, that's Uncle Tommy's initials. The year he disappeared. Yes, Lauren had looked up at her mother, her skepticism cracking. "This isn't possible." "I know, but it's happening." "Yes." They'd gone back to the cabin, and Lauren had read her grandfather's journal while Winry made dinner. When Winry had checked on her an hour later, Lauren had been crying quietly, one hand pressed against the page. "He really believed it," Lauren had whispered. "Grandpa really thought Uncle Tommy was alive somewhere. He was trying to save him." "He was. And you think he was right?" Winry had sat across from her daughter. "I think something extraordinary is happening. I don't know what it means. I don't know if the spring is real, or if Tommy could possibly be there. But I know I can't walk away without finding out." Lauren had wiped her eyes. "What's the next step?" "One more location. The 10th site. Cricket's been leading me to places my father marked. We've completed 9. There's one left. And then? And then, according to my father's theory, the sequence will be complete. A pathway will be open. We'll know if Lost Spring exists. We?" Winry had met her daughter's eyes. "You don't have to come." "Yes, I do." Lauren's voice had been firm. "If you're chasing after my uncle's ghost, if there's even a chance this is real, I'm not letting you do it alone." They'd sat together in the lamplight, mother and daughter, united by shared grief and impossible hope. Outside, Cricket had brayed softly, and the sound had carried through the walls like a promise. They'd spent the evening preparing together. Lauren, it turned out, had done her own research during the drive-up, reading everything she could find about thin places, sacred springs, and Ute spiritual traditions. She'd brought offerings of her own, a turquoise bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother, a photo of their family from before Tommy's disappearance, a lock of hair from her daughter. "If this is about connection," Lauren had said, "about love reaching across boundaries, then we bring tokens of connection." Winry had felt something in her chest unclench. This was the daughter she remembered, thoughtful, thorough, willing to engage with mystery while maintaining her intelligence. They'd lost years to distance and grief, but maybe, just maybe, they were finding their way back. That night, Winry had dreamed vividly for the first time since Cricket's arrival. She'd been standing at a pool of water so clear it looked like air. Tommy had been on the other side, his face peaceful, his eyes clear in a way they hadn't been since before the war. He'd looked perhaps 45 instead of the 60 he should be, but unmistakably himself. "You're close, Win," he'd said. His voice had been exactly as she remembered, gentle, slightly amused. "Just a little further. Don't be afraid. Are you real?" "Ah," she'd asked. "Or am I just imagining what I need to see?" "Does it matter?" "You'll know soon enough," he'd smiled. "Tell Mom. Tell her I found what I was looking for. Tell her I'm whole now." Winry had woken with tears on her face and her mother's name on her lips. Her mother, dead 16 years, who'd never stopped grieving her lost son, who'd died not knowing if Tommy had suffered, if he'd been afraid, if he'd thought of her at the end. In the pre-dawn darkness, Winry had made a decision. She'd pulled out her journal, not her field notes, but her personal journal that she rarely wrote in, and composed a letter to her mother. She'd told her everything that had happened, everything she'd discovered. She'd written, "I think Tommy's alive, Mom. I think he found a way to survive, to heal. I think I'm going to see him again. And when I do, I'll tell him you never stopped loving him." She'd sealed the letter in an envelope and left it on her table, just in case. At dawn, all three of them, Winry, Lauren and Cricket, had set out for the final location. Her father's map had marked it clearly. A frozen waterfall on the northeastern boundary of the old claim, where runoff from the high peaks created a dramatic cascade during spring melt. Winry knew the waterfall. She'd photographed it dozens of times over the years, had used it as a landmark when orienting field teams. It was striking but not unusual, water flowing over granite, freezing into fantastic ice formations each winter. She'd never noticed anything remarkable about it beyond its beauty, but as they'd approached it now, in the clear morning light with Cricket leading, she'd felt it, that same charged quality she'd experienced in the basin. The air tasted different, sound behaved strangely, and there was a pull, almost gravitational, drawing her forward. The waterfall was spectacular, frozen into a curtain of blue-white ice 30 feet high. At its base, icicles had formed a natural colonnade, like pillars supporting the frozen cascade. Cricket had walked directly to the ice and stopped. Lauren had gasped. "Mom, look at the rock face." Winry had looked. Behind the ice, visible through the crystalline formations, were symbols carved into the granite. Spirals and lines, geometric patterns, the same language she'd seen in the chamber. But these were extensive, covering perhaps 20 feet of rock face. A complete text or map in a language she couldn't read. "They're only visible from this angle," Lauren had said, moving carefully to get a better view. "From any other direction, they'd be hidden by the ice and the rock's contours." Winry had pulled out her father's journal and flipped to a sketch he'd made, a rough drawing of symbols he'd seen in a dream or vision. They matched the carvings on the rock face. Exactly, he saw these, Winry had said quietly. "Somehow, my father saw these before he died." Cricket had poured the snow at the waterfall's base, and Winry had knelt to investigate. There, half buried in frozen spray, was a flat stone with a depression in its center, clearly shaped by human hands, a natural altar or offering place. She cleared it carefully, revealing more symbols carved into the stone surface. Following her father's instructions, adapted from the journal's incomplete notes and what she'd learned from Vince, Winry had prepared to make the final offering. She'd brought a buckskin pouch that morning, filled with soil from the clearing where her cabin stood, the same land her family had claimed generations ago. She'd added the photograph Lauren had brought, showing their whole family before fracture. She'd included sage from Tommy's preserved canteen, completing the circle. And she'd added a lock of her own hair, cut that morning, blood to blood, family to family. Lauren had stepped forward and added her own items, the turquoise bracelet, a small drawing her daughter had made, a note she'd written to the uncle she barely remembered. "We're all here," she'd said softly. Everyone who loves him. Winry had placed the pouch in the stone's depression. Then, feeling foolish but determined, she'd spoken aloud. Tommy Dobbs, if you can hear me, if you're waiting somewhere beyond this place, we're here. Your family is here. We've followed the path you left. We've honored the places you marked. We're ready to bring you home. Her voice had echoed strangely in the enclosed space, seeming to multiply and harmonize with itself. Lauren had gripped her hand tightly. For a long moment, nothing had happened except the sound of their breathing and the distant whisper of wind through pines. Then Cricket's bell had begun to ring. Not from movement, the donkey stood perfectly still. But the bell rang with a clear, crystalline sound that grew louder and more insistent. Winry had looked at the donkey, her heart pounding, and made a decision she couldn't quite believe. She'd removed the bell from Cricket's collar and placed it at the center of the stone altar. Beside the buckskin pouch, the ringing had intensified. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in her chest, in her bones. Lauren had made a soft sound of wonder or fear. And then the ice had cracked, not breaking but shifting, the sound like distant thunder. Water had begun to flow behind the frozen curtain, moving in slow motion, glowing with pale, blue-green luminescence that shouldn't exist in nature. The carved symbols on the rock face had lit up, one by one, pulsing with the same ethereal light. Cricket had walked forward, directly toward the ice. Winry had reached out to stop him, but Lauren had gripped her arm. Let him go. The donkey had walked into the waterfall and vanished. Not behind it, not around it. Into it, as though the ice and water were a doorway. Winry's rational mind had screamed impossibility. But her heart, her intuition, the part of her that had followed Cricket this far, knew what she was seeing. The waterfall wasn't just a waterfall. It was the entrance, the door, the threshold between this world and wherever Tommy had been waiting for 30 years. Behind the flowing water, instead of solid rock face, there was a passage, filled with soft golden light, leading somewhere else. Lauren's hand had tightened on her arm. Mom, it's real. Yes, what do we do? Winry had looked at her daughter, this woman who'd driven through winter roads and suspended her disbelief because family mattered more than certainty. This woman who'd brought her own offerings and stood beside her mother despite fear and skepticism. And Winry had made the only choice possible. We go through. Together. Together. They'd stepped forward, hand in hand, toward the impossible waterfall. The water should have been freezing, should have been solid ice. Instead it was warm, where it touched Winry's face, flowing in that dreamlike slow cascade. Up close, she could see that it wasn't moving in normal physics. It was flowing sideways and upward, as much as down, following laws that didn't apply in this reality. She'd looked back once at the clearing, the mountains, the winter landscape that had been her home. Then she'd stepped through the water, pulling Lauren with her. The passage was both physical tunnel and something else entirely. The walls seemed to be stone one moment and light the next, shifting in ways that hurt to look at directly. Distance felt variable. They walked for what seemed like hours and seconds simultaneously. Sound was muffled, wrapped in cotton, with their footsteps echoing from directions that made no spatial sense. Lauren had whispered something, but the words had seemed to come from far away and very close at once. Winry had gripped her daughter's hand harder, the only solid thing in a space that was not quite real. And then the passage had opened. They'd emerged into a small valley that should not exist. The valley was perhaps half a mile across, ringed by mountains that looked simultaneously solid and translucent. The sky above was blue, but a shade of blue that didn't quite match any sky Winry had ever seen, deeper and somehow closer, as though they could reach up and touch it. The air was warm, not summer hot but spring gentle, comfortable in a way that defied the winter they'd left behind. At the center of the valley was a spring. It emerged from a crack in living granite, water so clear it looked like liquid light. The pool it formed was perfectly circular, perhaps 20 feet across, surrounded by grass that was impossibly green. Wildflowers bloomed around its edges, lupine and paintbrush and species Winry didn't recognize, colors too vivid to be entirely real. And there, sitting on a boulder beside the spring, whittling a piece of wood with a knife Winry recognized, was Tommy. He'd looked up at the sound of their footsteps. For a moment he'd simply stared, as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then a smile had broken across his face, a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy that Winry hadn't seen since before the war. "Took you long enough, Win," he'd said, and his voice had been exactly as she remembered, gentle, slightly rough, carrying the hint of amusement he'd always brought to life. Winry had tried to speak and couldn't. Her throat had closed, her eyes had filled with tears, and she'd simply stood there, shaking, looking at her brother, who'd been dead for 30 years, and was sitting 3 yards away, looking alive and real and whole. Tommy had set down his whittling and stood. He'd aged, she could see that, but not as he should have. He looked perhaps mid-40s, weathered by sun and weather, but healthy. His face still held the gentle quality she remembered, but the haunted look was gone. His eyes were clear, in a way they'd never been after he'd come back from the war. He'd stepped forward, and Winry had stumbled toward him, and then she'd been in his arms, both of them crying. 30 years of grief and relief pouring out in great shaking sobs. He'd smelled like pine smoke and clean water, felt solid and real, and his hand on her back had been the same comforting touch she remembered from childhood when he'd promised her everything would be okay. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered against her hair. "I'm so sorry, Win. I didn't mean to leave you all so long. Time doesn't work the same here. It's only been, God, maybe 8 months for me. But I knew decades were passing out there. I knew what it would do to all of you. I'm sorry. You're alive," she'd managed. "You're alive, and that's all that matters." They'd held each other for a long time. Then Tommy had noticed Lauren standing a few feet away, her face shocked and tear-streaked. He'd pulled back from Winry and looked at his niece, the girl who'd been 12 when he disappeared and was now a woman in her 40s. "Lauren." His voice had been wondering. "Little Lauren?" "Hi, Uncle Tommy," she'd said, and her voice had broken. "You missed my wedding, and my daughter's birth, and 30 years of birthdays. I know. I'm sorry." He'd opened his arms, and Lauren had stepped into them, and they'd stood there, the 3 of them, a family reassembling itself after 3 decades of absence. Finally, they'd separated, and Winry had looked around the valley more carefully. Cricket was there, standing near the spring, but he looked different, less entirely physical, more luminous, as though his true nature was showing through the donkey form. He'd been watching them with what looked like satisfaction. "Cricket," she'd said, "or whatever your real name is. Thank you." The donkey had touched his nose to her hand, and she'd felt a surge of warmth and affection that definitely hadn't come from an ordinary animal. Then he turned and walked toward the spring, his form becoming more translucent with each step until he'd simply faded into the light. Tommy had followed her gaze. "He volunteered to come get you," he'd said. "The spring, it has a kind of consciousness, or the space does, I'm not sure which. When I was finally ready to leave, ready to face the world again, I asked if there was a way to get a message out. Cricket appeared the next day, said he'd find you, lead you here. I didn't know if it would work, but why me?" Winry had asked. "Why not just appear at the cabin? Why the elaborate trail?" "Because you needed to choose it," Tommy had said simply. "This place, Lost Spring, or whatever name you want to give it, it doesn't work through coercion. You had to follow the trail willingly, had to believe enough to take each step. If Cricket had just shown up and said, 'Follow me to find your lost brother,' you'd have thought you were crazy. But following evidence, solving a mystery, that's who you are. He gave you a trail you could follow. It made sense in the strange logic of this place." Winry had looked at the spring, at the water that glowed within a light. "What is this place, Tommy, really?" He'd gestured for them to sit, and they'd settled on the soft grass near the spring. He'd explained it carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who'd had months to think about it. "I can't tell you the science, if there is science, but the indigenous people knew about it, and our great-grandfather found it by accident when he was prospecting. It's a thin place, like Dr. Hayes would call it. A spot where time and space work differently, where the boundary between physical and spiritual is permeable. When I came here, when I stumbled in through that waterfall running from PTSD, I couldn't handle anymore. I found peace, silence from the war in my head. A place where I could process what I'd seen and done without the noise and judgment of the regular world. But you aged, Lauren had said. Not as much as you should have, but you did age. Time here is slower, not stopped, Tommy had explained. For every month I experienced, maybe 3 or 4 years passed out there. I knew that somehow. The spring makes certain things clear. I knew Dad was looking for me, knew he was killing himself with obsession. I tried to send messages, dreams, whatever I could, but the connection was weak. When he finally found this place in his research, I thought maybe he'd understand. Maybe he'd tell everyone I was okay and chose to stay. But then he died. Tommy's voice had thickened. I felt it when he passed. The grief nearly pulled me back out. But I wasn't ready yet. I was still healing. What about Mom? Winry had asked quietly. I felt that too. Tommy had looked down at his hands. Every death, every major event, they echoed through somehow. When Mom died, when you retired, when Lauren got married, I felt all of it like distant music. And finally, about 8 months ago, I realized I was done. I'd healed as much as I could here. I was ready to go home. But I needed help from the outside. He'd looked at Winry with gratitude and something like awe. You did it, Win. You followed the trail. You believed the impossible. You completed Dad's work. You opened the door. They'd sat together for hours after that, or what felt like hours, though time clearly meant little here, catching up, sharing stories, filling the gap of 30 years. Tommy had asked careful questions about the world he'd left behind, about technology and politics, and all the ways things had changed. Winry and Lauren had told him about their lives, about the family he'd missed, about how his absence had shaped them all. At some point, Tommy had stood and walked to a small shelter at the valley's edge, a structure of fitted stones and woven branches. He'd returned carrying a walking stick, beautifully carved with intricate patterns, and had offered it to Winry. I made this for you, he'd said. Somehow I knew you'd be the one to come. It's a guide and a symbol, proof that this happened, that it was real. Keep it, remember it, and know that healing is possible even when it seems impossible. Winry had taken the stick, feeling the smooth wood, the careful craftsmanship. The initials carved near the handle, TD, matched those on the knife she still carried in her pack. Then Tommy had done something that had surprised them both. He'd walked to the spring, knelt beside it, and filled a canteen with the luminous water. He'd sealed it carefully and stood. We need to go soon, he'd said quietly. The passage stays open for a limited time once it's activated. And I need to thank this place before I leave. It saved my life. Literally gave me a reason to keep living when I had none. He'd knelt again, speaking words Winry couldn't quite hear, his hand flat on the earth beside the spring. She'd seen tears on his face and respected the privacy of his goodbye. When he'd stood, he'd looked peaceful, grateful, and ready. Time to go home, he'd said. Together, the three of them had walked back toward the passage. The valley had seemed to shimmer as though waving farewell. At the passage entrance, Tommy had paused and looked back one last time, his hand pressed to his heart. Then he'd turned and led them into the shifting space between worlds. The journey back was different. Time felt more linear, the passage more stable, as though the way had been secured by their purpose. Tommy walked ahead, confident, his hand trailing along walls that shifted between stone and light. Behind him, Winry and Lauren held hands, both of them afraid to speak, afraid to break whatever spell was allowing this impossible thing. When they emerged through the waterfall, it was into deep, cold and fading afternoon light. The three of them stood in the snow, breath steaming, utterly exhausted, and completely, impossibly alive. The waterfall had frozen again behind them, sealing shut, the symbols fading back into invisible. The passage was closed, the door locked, and they were back in the ordinary world where physics worked normally and dead men didn't return. Except Tommy was here. Solid, real, shivering in clothes, meant for spring weather in a place outside time. Lauren had immediately shrugged out of her parka and draped it over his shoulders. He'd accepted it with a grateful smile that crinkled his eyes the way it always had. "We need to get off this mountain," Winry had said practically, her training taking over. "All of us are hypothermic. It'll be dark in an hour, and we have a 6-mile hike." They'd started down, moving as quickly as conditions allowed. Tommy had struggled initially. His body was in good condition, but calibrated for a different climate, a different reality. Winry and Lauren had supported him between them, their combined strength keeping him moving. Halfway down, Lauren had pulled out her satellite phone and made a call to a friend who worked search and rescue. "We need extraction," she'd said simply. 3 adults, upper Cascade drainage, all mobile but exhausted. "Can you get a snowcat up the lower road?" She'd given coordinates and ended the call. Then she'd looked at Winry and Tommy and said, "We're not explaining this tonight. Tonight you're a lost hiker we found. Tomorrow we figure out the truth." Tommy had nodded gratefully. Winry had felt a surge of love for her daughter's practical wisdom. They'd met the snowcat at the roadhead as darkness fell completely. The operator, a weathered man named Jim, whom Winry had known for years, had taken one look at Tommy and immediately wrapped him in emergency blankets and forced hot chocolate into his hands. He'd asked no questions beyond confirming they were all unhurt, then transported them down to where Lauren's car was parked. At the cabin, they'd built up the fire, changed into dry clothes, and eaten soup that Lauren had prepared while Winry got Tommy settled. The mundane tasks had felt surreal after the impossibility of the day, but they'd also been grounding, a bridge back to normal life. That night, as Tommy had slept deeply in Winry's bed, his face peaceful in the firelight, the two women had sat together at the kitchen table. "What happens now?" Lauren had asked quietly. "I don't know," Winry had admitted. "Legally, he's been declared dead. He has no identification, no medical records from the last 30 years, no explanation for where he's been that anyone will believe. We could tell the truth. Could we? Would you believe it if someone told you this story?" Lauren had been quiet for a moment. "No, I wouldn't. Then we tell a simpler truth. He was suffering from PTSD, went off-grid, lived as a hermit in remote locations, recently decided to reconnect with family. It's not uncommon for veterans to do that. People will accept it because it fits their understanding of possible. And the real truth we keep between us. Between family." Winry had looked at the canteen Tommy had brought back, sitting now on her mantel beside the bell. "We have proof for ourselves. That's enough." The weeks that followed had been complicated in exactly the ways they'd anticipated. The legal process of resurrecting Tommy's identity had been Byzantine and frustrating. Medical examinations had revealed him to be impossibly healthy for a man his age, with the bone density and cardiovascular health of someone decades younger. Psychologists had evaluated him and found him remarkably well-adjusted. Though he'd maintained the cover story about living off-grid, Dr. Hayes had visited, ostensibly to welcome Tommy back, but really to hear the story. Winry had told him everything in private, and he'd listened with the careful attention of a scholar encountering something that rewrote his understanding of reality. At the end, he'd simply nodded and said, "Some truths can't be proven, only witnessed. Thank you for trusting me with this." Lauren had returned to Denver, but visited every other weekend now instead of monthly. She'd brought her daughter, Winry's granddaughter Emma, to meet the uncle who'd become possible. Emma, 15 and sharp-eyed, had looked at Tommy and said, "You're the one who was lost and got found." "That's right," Tommy had said. Cool. And she'd accepted it with the easy grace of youth that hadn't yet learned what was supposed to be. Impossible. Tommy had moved into the cabin, temporarily while they'd sorted out his reintegration. He and Winry had fallen into an easy rhythm, sharing cooking duties, maintaining the property, taking walks in the forest he'd left behind so long ago. They'd talked for hours about everything and nothing, filling in gaps, relearning each other. He'd told her more about Lost Spring, about the healing he'd experienced there. The silence was the first gift, he'd said. The war sounds stopped. Then came the ability to forgive myself, the people who'd sent me, the people I'd fought. And finally came purpose, understanding that my trauma was also my teacher, that I could help others if I returned. Within a month, he'd started volunteering at a veterans center in Durango, leading support groups for PTSD survivors. His story, the sanitized version, resonated deeply. A soldier who'd walked away and found healing, then returned to help others. He never mentioned the spring, never claimed supernatural intervention. But the men and women he counseled sensed something in him, a peace earned through genuine suffering, a wisdom bought with real cost. 6 months after their emergence from the impossible, the family had gathered at Winry's cabin for what Lauren had called a proper reunion. It was early summer, the meadows bright with flowers, the snow finally gone from all but the highest peaks. Tommy had spent the morning teaching Emma how to identify animal tracks. Lauren and Winry had cooked together, laughing over shared tasks in a way they hadn't since Lauren was young. That evening, as the sun set fire to the western peaks, they'd all sat on the porch together. Tommy had his arms around Emma, pointing out constellations emerging in the darkening sky. Lauren had leaned against her mother's shoulder, the years of distance finally fully healed. And Winry had felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 decades, complete peace. On the mantel inside, the canteen sat beside a framed photograph Jim had taken that first night. Winry, Tommy and Lauren standing together outside the cabin, exhausted and smiling, caught in the moment of impossible reunion. The water in the canteen never evaporated, never grew stale. It glowed faintly in darkness, a reminder that some healings transcend normal law. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Winry sat at her table with her journal, the same journal she'd written in for 40 years, recording observations, noting patterns, documenting the natural world. She opened to a fresh page and began to write, not as a scientist this time, but as a woman who'd witnessed something that transcended her training. "Some things can't be tracked with GPS or explained by science," she wrote. "Some things require faith in what seems impossible. I've spent my whole life observing the measurable, the provable, the rational. I thought that was the only truth worth pursuing. But cricket taught me, and Tommy taught me, and this whole impossible journey taught me that the deepest truths often live in spaces our instruments can't measure. Love transcends time. That's not poetry. It's what I witnessed. Tommy was kept alive by love. His family's love, his own will to heal, and maybe something bigger than both. The spring, or whatever consciousness inhabits that place, responded to genuine need. It held space for healing when our world couldn't, and when he was ready, it sent a guide to lead us back together. I don't know how to categorize this in my field notes. There's no species classification for spirit donkeys, no tracking protocol for journeys between worlds. But I know what I saw. I know who came home. And I know that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that can't be published, can't be peer-reviewed, can only be carried in the heart and shared with those who have the courage to believe. Cricket appeared at my door on the coldest morning of the year and gave me back my brother. That's the only fact that matters. She closed the journal and looked out the window. The forest was dark, peaceful, familiar. And there, just at the tree line, she saw them, fresh tracks in the soft earth. Small hoofprints leading from the forest to the cabin and then away again, vanishing at the clearing's edge. Winry smiled. Some guides never truly leave. Some mysteries don't need solving, only honoring. She stood, went to the door and opened it. The night air was cool and pine-scented, alive with the sounds of the mountain settling into darkness. She stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the last 6 months, the last 30 years, finally lifting. "Thank you," she said quietly to the forest, to Cricket, to whatever force had orchestrated this impossible reunion. "Thank you for bringing him home. Thank you for teaching me that some trails lead to places maps can never show." The forest seemed to shimmer, just for a moment, as though acknowledging her words. Then it settled back into ordinary darkness, ordinary silence, ordinary reality. Except nothing felt quite ordinary anymore. And that, Winry thought as she closed the door and returned to the warm cabin where her brother slept soundly and her family's fractures had finally healed, was the greatest gift of all. The next morning, Tommy woke early and found Winry already up, coffee made, sitting on the porch as she'd done every morning for years. He joined her, accepting the mug she poured, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun touch the peaks with gold. "Do you miss it?" Winry asked finally. "The spring?" Tommy considered. "Sometimes. It was peaceful there in a way the world rarely is. But this," he gestured to the mountains, the cabin, the life unfolding around them. "This is worth more. Connection is worth more. Love is worth more, even with all the noise and pain, especially with the noise and pain. That's what makes the peace meaningful." He looked at her. "You saved me, Win, not just by opening the door, but by refusing to give up. You spent 30 years carrying the weight of my disappearance. I wish I could give you those years back." "You did," Winry said simply. "You came home. That's all I needed." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, brother and sister reunited, impossible made real through perseverance and love. Inside the cabin, Lauren was waking, and soon Emma would bounce out, asking questions about breakfast and whether they could go hiking. Normal life, miraculous in its ordinariness, was unfolding around them. And on the mantel, barely visible in the growing light, the water in Tommy's canteen glowed softly, a reminder that healing exists, that second chances are real, that some doors once opened reveal possibilities worth any journey. In the forest beyond, a small shape moved through the shadows, four-legged, patient, watching over the family it had brought together. Cricket, or whatever his true name was, had completed his task, but like all good guides, he remained close just in case. Just in case they needed to find their way again. Just in case another impossible journey called. Some trails never truly end. Some guides never fully leave. And some loves are strong enough to reach across worlds, through time, past every obstacle, to bring the lost ones home. Winry raised her coffee mug in a silent salute to the forest, to Cricket, to the mystery that had given her back her brother. And somewhere in the trees, a bell chimed softly once, acknowledging her gratitude, promising that some magic, once witnessed, never quite fades. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent, as they always had. But Winry knew better now. They held secrets in their folds, thin places and healing springs and pathways between worlds. They kept their promises in their own time, and they yielded their gifts only to those brave enough to follow where tiny donkeys led, trusting that some trails, however impossible they seemed, were worth walking to the end. She finished her coffee, stood and stretched. Behind her, Tommy was greeting Lauren and Emma as they emerged, sleepy and smiling. The day was beginning, ordinary, precious, impossible. And Winry, who'd spent 40 years tracking animals through wilderness, had finally tracked down the most elusive prey of all. Hope fulfilled, family restored, love proven stronger than time or death or 30 years of grief. It was enough. It was everything. And somewhere in the forest, Cricket turned and walked deeper into the trees. His work complete, his promise kept, fading like mist into morning light, until the next time someone needed a guide through the impossible, until the next lost one needed bringing home. The weeks turned into months, and summer settled over the high country with a gentleness that felt like benediction. Tommy's reintegration into the world continued in small, steady steps. The legal complications gradually resolved themselves. With patience and Lauren's connections in the medical system, they navigated the bureaucratic maze of resurrecting a man who'd been declared dead 3 decades ago. The Veterans Center in Durango had become Tommy's anchor. 3 times a week, he drove down from the cabin to lead support groups, and the work clearly fed something essential in him. Winry watched him come alive in ways he'd never managed before his disappearance, purposeful, centered, using his own hard-won healing to light paths for others still struggling in darkness. One evening in late July, as Winry sat on the porch watching thunderheads build over the western peaks, Tommy joined her with 2 bottles of beer salvaged from Lauren's last visit. "I've been thinking about Dad," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "about how close he came. If he'd lived another few months, maybe a year, he might have figured it out. Might have opened the door himself." "He did figure it out," Winry said quietly. "The journal, the maps, the theory about the sequence, he had all the pieces. His heart just gave out before he could complete it. You finished his work. We finished his work. You, me, Cricket, even Lauren. It took all of us. Tommy nodded, took a long pull from his beer. I dream about him sometimes. He's standing at the spring, smiling, telling me he knew I'd be okay, that he knew you'd find the way. You think he's there? At the spring? I don't know, maybe. Or maybe the spring just holds echoes of everyone who's touched it. He looked at his sister. Does it matter? Either way, his love reached across death to help bring me home. That's real, whether it's literal or symbolic. They sat in comfortable silence as the storm moved closer, the smell of rain on pine reaching them before the first drops fell. Inside, the canteen on the mantel caught the fading light. Glowing softly as it always did, Lauren and Emma arrived the following weekend. Emma now sporting a collection of wildlife field guides she'd been studying obsessively. She'd decided she wanted to be a tracker like her grandmother. And Winry had been teaching her the basics, how to read sign, how to move quietly, how to observe without disturbing. On Saturday morning, the four of them hiked together up to the meadow above the cabin. It was an easy trail, well within Tommy's rebuilt stamina, and Emma bounded ahead with the boundless energy of 15, occasionally stopping to photograph tracks or identify flowers. At the meadow's edge, Emma suddenly stopped and called back, "Grandma!" "Come look at this." Winry joined her granddaughter and her breath caught. There in the soft earth beside a small seep spring were fresh tracks. Small hoofprints, impossibly delicate, leading from the forest to the water and back again. "Miniature donkey," Emma said confidently, consulting her mental catalogue of track identification. "But that's weird. There are no farms up here that would have one." "Very weird," Winry agreed, meeting Tommy's eyes over Emma's head. He smiled, understanding, passing between them without words. "Can we follow them?" Emma asked eagerly. "Not today," Lauren said firmly, with the authority of a mother who sensed mysteries better left alone. "Those tracks could be old, and we have lunch waiting back at the cabin." But Winry knelt beside the tracks, placing her hand gently in one perfect hoofprint. The earth was still damp, the track fresh, made within the last hour, maybe the last few minutes. Cricket was still here, still watching over them, still moving through these mountains like a promise kept and renewed. "Thank you," she whispered too quietly for the others to hear. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch and Lauren was reading by lamplight, Tommy and Winry stood together outside under a sky brilliant with stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke and the particular clarity that comes after mountain rain. "I've been thinking about what I'd tell people if I could," Tommy said. "If I could speak the real truth about where I was and what I learned, what would you say? That healing is possible even when it seems impossible. That love is stronger than time or distance or even death. That sometimes the journey requires us to step outside everything we think we know and trust in mysteries we can't explain." He paused. "And that guides come in unexpected forms, sometimes on 4 tiny hooves when we're ready to be led." Winry smiled. "That's a good message. Will you write it down? In your journal? So someone someday might know the full story?" "I already have," she assured him. "Every word, every impossible moment. It's there for whoever needs to find it." They stood together in the darkness, brother and sister, survivors of a mystery that had reshaped their understanding of reality itself. Inside the cabin, their family slept peacefully. On the mantel, the canteen glowed with its steady, impossible light. And somewhere in the forest, Cricket moved through shadows. A guardian spirit in donkey form, watching over the family he'd brought together. The mountains stood eternal, holding their secrets in deep folds of stone and time. But Winry knew now what she'd spent 40 years learning to see, that some truths lived beyond measurement, that some trails led to destinations no map could show, and that the most important journeys required only trust, love, and the courage to follow where small guides led. She looked up at the stars and felt, for the first time in 3 decades, completely whole.